Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of Decisions Now. I am your host, Erin Pearson, along with Rigvi Chavala. And today we are so excited to have Ben Mu as our guest. He is the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at Adobe. So welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Aaron, and nice to be here.
Awesome. So we actually have some pretty cool topics for today. One of the things that we've been talking about a little bit before and is really prevalent today is data governance. So it's something that a lot of people, especially companies, that they oftentimes have a lot of data, but they don't know what to do with it or how to use it. And then there's a lot of strategy about how to do it properly. So how do you guys actually see people building the data governance strategy today?
Sure, that's a great question, and especially in the situation like right now with the crisis over in Ukraine, data governance has been again been prominent and displayed in every data leader's front and center. What Adobe, from our point of view, and how my organization are implementing data governance is, in addition to the traditional data governance approach, which are more built around processes and standards, and relying on the individuals such as data professionals and analytics professionals to follow the rules, to follow the process to do that. In addition to that, we're also building what we call enterprise data asset hub, which is a centralized data processing capability that will process data in a real-time, streamlined, event-driven fashion. Along that journey, for each touch point, when data touches any component of our ecosystem, there are rules and there are events defined of what data governance should happen there, such as if the data is PII, then when touching this system, should the data be hashed? Should it be protected? What kind of access rule and protection should be there? And then applying microservices to run the event to enable that governance there. And that's the entire journey of life cycle from where data is generated, passing through our entire the life cycle and ecosystem, all the way to the end user part and controlled by user group and user access control. Therefore, we're putting two parallel paths to that. One is train and require the professionals to follow the process, follow the standard. On the other hand, is governance is embedded through across the data lifecycle journey. Therefore, it is no longer a parallel process anymore. And also, in a way, it is automatically enabled.
That's very interesting, Ben. I didn't realize there was so much automation because traditional data governance means a ton of team members like pouring through the incoming data feeds, making sure you run those PII or any obfuscation rules before it actually gets to the next stage, right? It sounds like what you're saying is even all of those steps can be automated completely, and therefore it's no longer a parallel task. Is my understanding right?
Rugby, your understanding is correct. That's where we want to drive towards, and bring data governance front and center, and no longer being a sometimes an afterthought. Sometimes is if it is not embedded process in the daily operation, it is always forgotten. Either most of them are not intentionally, but once it's forgotten, then they will create a gap of data governance, which is the weakness of control. So our journey is just started, and we have designed our infrastructure and the entire architecture on how that should be implemented. And we've chosen the technology components, including all different repository technology and also what streaming services we want to put in place, and start to build in the data governance there. And again, the data governance, what we also want to do there is using less coding, more configuration. Therefore, the data governance rules and standard are being stored in the repository and continue to grow and enable and allowing the data professionals, when they use that, they can also choose what user group they belong to. Then automatically, the type of governance rules and standard will be tied to that along the journey for them to use. So this is our entire design concept, which is event-driven, microservices, streaming, and less code, more configuration.
So as you do that, and especially as you have like the different gaps in the system, so you have to monitor to make sure that the gaps aren't happening as you are pulling things forward, because naturally you get one, and I guess there's the common expression, it's only as strong as the weakest link. So how do you actually ensure that this actually gets put in place? Are you using AI to kind of create this automation and monitor for it?
Aaron, that's a great question. If you asked me this question a few months ago, I wouldn't be able to have a solid answer to address that. Instead of really using the observability type of data, monitoring that and react to that. Today in Adobe, we just built a prototype of product, which is called Adobe Now. And what that is a real-time performance monitoring dashboard. So the mechanism is you can choose what KPIs you want to monitor and tie that KPI to the source. So the tool will tie the KPI to the source data. And then in real time, you'll be able to monitor how the KPI performs, whether there's a anomaly or it is performing within the threshold of where it's supposed to be. And also we use a machine learning model to predict what that KPI in real time, what trend line it should be. Therefore, we have multiple mechanisms to be able to detect if there's an anomaly happening and immediately alert that. I remember when I said on the data governance side is we're building the registry for data governance rules and standards, and therefore it is all tied to the real-time performance and can be viewed as KPI. Therefore, using the dashboard, we actually can be able to monitor how data governance, whether it is performing and it is being enforced. And if there's any lapse happening or if there's any anomaly happen, we can see that immediately. And then tying to the current event, what might be happening. So that's what we are building, and that is on the journey what we want to address. Again, the goal is automated, embedded in the entire life cycle process, and also scalable.
And what would be an example of a KPI bin in that example in that whole ecosystem that you just mentioned, right? Would it be something like a order transaction costs, or would it be the search terms that the end users are searching for? What's like are those KPIs?
So two types of example I can share with you. If not related to the data governance topic we discussed here, but related with the business performance, that can be anything such as number of users logging in right now, number of projects are being built using Adobe Creative Cloud, and number of users signed in, so on and so forth. So these are the real-time business performance, and we can track them, tying that to the current any market, world event, Adobe event, anything to explain the trend and also deviation. Now coming back to the data governance topic is a KPI. One of the KPIs that could be being tracked in real time is the data that designated as PII are being hashed at this junction, at this system, how many of them? And if we start to see a data inflow here, but seeing a PII hashing, creating a drop here, then coming back, then immediately we will notice there's a breakdown of the governance either by user intentionally or there's a system breakdown. So that needs to be double click and investigate.
Wow, fascinating. And so just taking a step back though, right? Like, again, in our world, like we help a lot of enterprises with making such decisions. Like in this example too, someone can look at that trend line and immediately take an action. So from a B2C standpoint, it makes sense and it's typically relatable. But how do you see it on the B2B end? Because we're talking data governance is typically upstream, right? The decision making happens at a later point because you have to synthesize it and produce kind of next steps or decision points. Because we're talking upstream, how does that impact like a B2B decision making? Is there an example that you can elaborate on?
If it's related with the data governance, I think related to B2B, the topic is even broader, especially when it related to upstream and also even on downstream, such as cataloging and also the registration. So I think what can happen also over there is tying the data governance procedure and process with third party data provider that would actually provide more authoritative data there, and using that as the comparison to your cataloging of the enterprise, either is a client or company registration, and also any other subjects such as related to the company, the profile themselves or access to that. So it can have other aspect. I think it's really broad, but Rakib, I think this is worth of a dive deeper to have a more of a case by case type of a conversation
Absolutely.
than to cover that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things about this, though, is when you're creating the automations and the algorithms that are going into it and ML to predict trends and KPIs and how they're coming together, there's one school of thought that technically the algorithm is always right in how you've set it up to be, but it's also right based on the data set that you put in to the algorithm. So when you are creating these trend lines and you are relying on them for these business decisions, how are you actually creating this pool of data that you know is high enough quality to get you to where you need to go?
Oh wow, this really touched upon the core of data management, which is data quality and is the data really is cleansed and usable, or it requires additional work. This again is at the beginning when I talk about the enterprise data asset hub concept. It is inside itself. It has a framework of how to process data from different sources. Either it's a logging data, or it is monitoring data, or it is product data, depending on where data come from, and depending on the past history, there will be the trending analysis over there to determine the quality of data. So data quality is not only by looking at the data cleanness itself, such as data type, there's a missing columns and missing attributes, so on and so forth, but also is if the data received at this time should be the volume that to be received at this time. So if you look at in the past, for example, like based on past, at around this time at 3 p.m. Eastern time, we should have received, say, about 3 million events at this moment. But if we only receive 1 million, even though the data is clean, that still poses a data quality issue because there is something else that causing that variation that may attribute and contribute to that drop, and it may in fact reflect the data quality by itself, or in turn, this section of the data, as of right now, when you look at that, it may not be usable because it does not fit into the profile. Therefore, it should be out. So that's another way of considering of the data quality. And also, when it comes to machine learning and AI, is all of these needs to be conducted before you structure the feature and doing the feature engineering and also apply the algorithm to that. Otherwise, this variation, if you bake into machine learning, then it may impact future predictions as well.
Yeah, so you'd have to weed out those anomalies, like you mentioned, but then the training should be based on a time series, like a historical set of data that you've already collected.
Yes.
And in some cases, I mean, when you're starting fresh, right? Obviously, you might have a little bit of wrong or incorrect predictions at that point. But to your point, I think over time, though, it always kind of converges. So in some cases, though, like what we see with our domains, we don't necessarily have that historical information, and even if it's there, it's not clean, right? All the way down to phone numbers or addresses or whatever that information is, even if it's not PII, for example, then it kind of we have to default back to a manual exercise to go look at that, clean it, perhaps even tweak the algorithms.
Oh, that's painful.
Which I totally agree. It is painful. But sometimes to get a better algorithm, you have to rely on the subject matter experts. So I guess in your experience, Adobe or prior, have you ever relied on like these experts to help make that judgment call before you completely switch to a machine learning approach?
Great question. On this subject, I think there are multiple ways of addressing that, but none of them is clean. I'm probably going to go through several combination to address that. In the past, and also here at Adobe, we also heavily rely on third-party data. Third-party data which is more authoritative, such as vendors like Axiom and LiveRAM and so on and so forth. And because they would provide a most recent and cleansed the individual data. So we can use that to append and also to check. Sometimes is to replace the data we collect because that data is more current. Additionally, but that wouldn't cover 100%. So we still build machine learning algorithms is using fuzzy logic, using different combinations of name, address, and the city block, everything to compare to cleanse of the data that whether it is truly usable or not. In the end, oftentimes if we can get up to 95% of the data, either it's history or current, that is we believe is truly clean, it would help on the machine learning and also AI on that side of work really going forward. So that's where the standard we're looking after, driving up towards.
One of the things that you mentioned was making sure that you have different data sources. You want to make sure that you have like the timeliness of data as well. So would have to imagine it's going to depend on the decision that you're making and the actual inputs that you're looking at. But how do you actually look at what is up-to-date data and at what point does it actually get stale and you're no longer going to be using it?
Oh boy, I wish I had the answer for that.
Doesn't everybody?
It's really educated decision. We have our record retention policy. So financial records at 7 years. But I think the topic, Aaron and Raghib, you really mentioned here is really related with the more latency data and also the kind of the real-time data. How long you deem that is valuable, and how long you want to store that, because everything associated with a cost and everything associated with a value. For some of the data, for example, the usage of the customer experience or usage of the product data, that at the moment that data is being collected, it has the highest value. As time goes by, the value of that data goes down, but the cost of that data for storage goes up. So where the balance really is really where it is. That is when is you need to go through is what do you need that data for? The nature of the data, and looking at the data itself to see by what time and when the value of the data start to decline, and the cost start to outpace the value of itself. That's probably the moment when you want to consider either data will be purged, archived, or put into the cold storage.
Now, I can think of an example, Aaron, that you just mentioned, right? So, and like Ben said, it depends on the type of data and what the purpose of that is. Like, for example, I know Uber collects your GPS coordinates as you go as a passenger, as a driver, and they also kind of utilize that to understand the traffic patterns. But then you don't need that beyond a year, because then it's cyclical. Every month of the year you have weather patterns. You don't need to keep it for 5-6 years. You just can purge it after a year. But then there's also like transient data that they just purge like after 5 minutes, because they don't care where you were 5 minutes ago.
That's right.
So there's all these like depends on the purpose, I guess.
Exactly. Totally agree. The value of data is there, but their latency, their timeliness is really all differs.
So, I think we're running low on time, so I have 2 questions left. The first question is for both of you. So if both of you were to give advice to somebody who is building their like a data governance strategy for their company, what would be the top piece of advice that you would give to them?
You want me to get started?
Sure.
For it?
Please.
Okay. My advice will be is have a broader view of the company, how data is being used, and start with a high level strategy, but do not boil the ocean all at once. Scope it and do that one step at a time, showing the achievement, implement the data governance strategy and also the approach. So start to show the value, train the users to get used to it, follow it, build into their nature, and use that gradually to roll out to the entire company.
Perfect. No, in fact, just to add to what Ben said, it also, I think you have to prioritize and figure out exactly what you need, but also look at it more from a decisioning standpoint. And like I mentioned earlier, because data governance is upstream, you need to know what the decision impact point is, right, of that data point, and therefore you work backwards from there. So as an example, if you're in the procurement division and you have to make decisions on your vendors, well, if that is your decision point, then go backwards and say, okay, what is going to enable you to make that decision, and what data points do you need, and do you have that data? And if you do, is it clean enough, and do you have a data governance around it? And so that forms the entire scope for you to make that one decision impact, and that'll help you prioritize.
Excellent.
Cool. So my last question is for you, Ben, and I do like to end on a fun question as well. So I know, of course, that you are an avid biker. So when is the next 100-mile ride?
I'd like to say this weekend, but this weekend is going to snow, so no way. It's going to be, the next will be when the weather is warm enough, then I'll do that. I think it's going to be in May, early May.
Okay.
There you go. In fact, I remember seeing a picture of the bike, Ben. Was that your bike?
That was my bike.
Oh
yes.
My goodness, it looks amazing.
I love it, but it's a toy. But it's really good a good exercise.
Nice.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you so much,
Right,
and
thanks.
have a nice day.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Aaron.
This podcast was produced by Heartcast Media.